Sometime in 1993, maybe 1994, Adam Staley found himself at Magic the Gathering tournaments and noticed that people were tired. Half the competitors were playing the exact same deck, and that level of repetition created a difficult environment for social interaction. And so, Staley came up with his own way to play Magic, something more casual and relaxed. In his format, players built 100-card decks, in which each card, including basic lands, was only allowed a single time, and both players started the game at 100 life. The idea was that you would see different cards that people weren't using anymore because they had no choice. They had a 100-card deck, and every single card had to be different. Staley told Polygon's Charlie Hall in a fantastic article that you can find in the description. Staley dubbed his format Highlander, based on the 1986 movie, and he carried it along to his local community. In 1996, Jesus M. Lopez submitted a custom format to the Duelist magazine, which they printed in their House Rules section. Lopez called it Elder Dragon Legend Wars. In Elder Dragon Legend Wars, each player had to choose one of the 5 original legendary Elder Dragons as their leader. The choice of dragon then informed how the deck should be built, limiting its colors to those of the Elder Dragon. Additionally, players were instructed to build 60-card decks that included 8 basic lands of each of their colors and only creatures with power and toughness of 3 or higher, exempting those with special abilities. Elder Dragon Legend Wars was also a Highlander format, restricting players to only one of each card in their deck, with the exception of basic lands. To balance the decks, all players were asked to agree on a total power and toughness of the creatures in their deck, which they should limit themselves to. Similarly, they should come to an agreement on a ban list, although some suggestions were given: Balance, Anarchy, Gloom, and Wrath of God. Players also had to designate and announce 3 of their creatures as warlords and 2 more as their captains. If a captain was killed, its controller lost 2 life and the destroyer gained that same amount, while if a warlord was killed, that was increased to 3 each, and for the Elder Dragon Legend, the controller lost 4 and the destroyer gained 4. Finally, each player started with 25 life and 1 basic land of each type already in play, and the game was recommended for 3 or more players. Elder Dragon Legend Wars already carried a lot of similarities with modern Commander. Each deck had an Elder Dragon leader and a color identity. But it also had some other curious features. The idea of captains and warlords was neat, but for some reason, being one of those 2 was entirely a downside for their controller. However, I do kind of like how this format streamlined the early game by just starting everybody with 3 lands in play. This probably had some negative balance implication, but I think it's a cute idea. To return to 1996, Adam Staley also introduced Elder Dragon leaders and color identity into his Highlander format, although he says that he doesn't remember reading the Elder Dragon Legend Wars article. In no way do I mean to accuse Staley of lying. I believe him when he says he doesn't remember. But there was a 24-year gap between the article and the Polygon interview. I think it's likely that Staley either saw or heard of Elder Dragon Legend Wars and was at least subconsciously inspired by it. Either way, the introduction of a leader, or as they would be called, a general, and color identity formed the basis of what was then dubbed Elder Dragon Highlander. At first, EDH remained a 2-player game, but eventually Staley and his friends adapted the game to allow for a larger group, often 5 players, each of which piloted one of the Elder Dragons, and this is the format that Staley then brought to Alaska. Sometime in 2002, somewhere in Anchorage, Sheldon Menery found himself in the same board game group as Adam Staley, who introduced him to Elder Dragon Highlander. It wasn't anything big at the time. The group treated the format as just another from many things to do with Magic cards. Despite that, his format had developed a more complex rule set than what Staley started with. I will refer to this version as Alaskan EDH. In Alaskan EDH, every card, including basic lands, was restricted to a single copy, and all cards that were allowed in Vintage or Type 1, as it was called back then, were allowed, with exactly one exception, which was Test of Endurance. This was likely because of the health system they used at the time. A game of Alaskan EDH had a total health pool of 200, which was divided up evenly among the players when the game started. If 3 players were playing, then they would each start with 67 life, and 8 players with 25. Importantly, of course, 4 players would start with 50 each, meaning that Test of Endurance's win condition was easily fulfilled, which is why it was banned. The pool of available generals was also expanded from only the 5 Elder Dragons to any legendary creature from specifically the Legends set, and apart from the general, no other legendary creature from Legends was allowed to appear in a deck. I think it's worth pointing out here that there was no command zone. Generals were shown before each game and then shuffled into the deck like any other card. Generals were also limited to 1 copy per local community, meaning if somebody was already playing Nicol Bolas, a new player wasn't allowed to bring a Nicol Bolas deck, or even have Nicol Bolas in their deck. It seems to me that they took the idea of Highlander very seriously back then, and these limitations existed to ensure that each general was truly unique. But it's also worth keeping in mind that the legend rule worked differently back then. If one player had a legendary creature in play, no other player was allowed to play that same legend. In a format that was centered around legendary creatures but only had a very limited pool of them, this could have resulted in a frustrating gameplay experience. A bit later, in 2004, the legend rule would be updated and made arguably worse for EDH. Starting with Champions of Kamigawa, if 2 players had the same legendary creature in play, then they both had to be sacrificed. This meant that every legendary creature was also removable for that same legendary creature if an opponent controlled one, making duplicates in a pot quite effective hate pieces. However, the 1 per player limitation on Legends also meant that there were only 55 possible generals available for any given local community. And local community was defined as, for example, the entirety of Alaska. I have to assume that if you were the 56th Alaskan EDH player, you had to duel one of the existing ones to death to get access to their general. Admittedly, this wasn't likely to be a problem anytime soon, as when the blog post that I'm basing this information on was written, there seemed to be 10 Alaskan EDH players. While generals didn't have their own dedicated space just yet, they were still given a small layer of protection, as they couldn't be exiled and would instead be placed in their owner's graveyard if they would be, and if their owner chose to do so. They also already dealt commander damage, meaning that any player who took 21 damage from an Elder Dragon immediately lost the game. Now, you might have noticed that I just said Elder Dragon instead of General. Yeah, I'm not entirely sure how this worked, as the blog post specifically said 21 damage from an Elder Dragon, not 21 damage from a General. This could either be a simple typo, or it could be that the Elder Dragons were given special treatment, which I think is a possibility because even back then, they just weren't good. Now, a common commander myth is that the odd number of 21 required damage for commander damage kill stemmed from the Elder Dragons having 7 attack, and that originally the rule was just that 3 attacks from an Elder Dragon were enough for a kill. But I couldn't find any evidence of this. Even the earliest sources always talk about 21 commander damage, not 3 attacks. I would be delighted if anybody could find evidence of this claim, and if you do, then please leave it in the comments and I'll give it a heart. But until proven otherwise, I have to assume that it's always been just specifically 21. I think it's interesting too that, considering generals were just another creature in each player's deck, commander damage kills must have been unbelievably rare. Finally, Alaskan EDH was a melee format. There's a format called Grand Melee that exists today, the rules of which would make sense given the context, as it's a multiplayer-specific format. But was 2002 Melee the same as 2024 Grand Melee? After quite a while of researching, I eventually found the first mention of an MTG Melee format in the Duelist magazine number 2 from summer 1994. On pages 34 and 35, on a horribly unreadable background, Richard Garfield describes a 40-player Melee event that he ran at RadCon in Richmond. But before he gets to that, he first illustrates the issues he sees with multiplayer games, putting emphasis on how he didn't like that frequently the quietest player wins, and saying that he didn't regard very highly the variation of Magic where players can attack anyone and the last player in the game wins. Basically, what I'm saying is that I don't think 1994 Richard Garfield would have liked Modern Commander, which is just kind of interesting. After this small explainer, he then goes on to describe the Melee format. A large number of players were all seated at the same table, and then were only allowed to attack the player to the left of them. Additionally, each player had a limited range of influence, meaning their spells and effects would only affect themselves and the two players to their left as well as the two players to their right. For example, if they played Wrath of God, they would only hit the boards of the 5 players in their range of influence, and similarly, those boards were the only ones they could target with anything. The winner was then decided based upon points, which were earned by knocking out other players. Garfield then described the game in more detail as it happened, even offering this wonderful illustration. Apparently, it took over 5 hours to finish, and at first he seemed a bit overwhelmed by what they had just done. But in the afterglow, he regretted nothing. I hope to ever enjoy anything as much as Richard Garfield seemed to enjoy this 40-player Melee game. Either way, since Alaskan EDH also used a Melee rule set, I assume it followed the rules laid out by Richard Garfield in this article, which were actually really similar to modern Melee, but with a range of influence of 2 instead of the 1 from today. But before we move on, and this isn't relevant to anything, but the Duelist magazine had a picture of this man on pages 40 and 41. There's no context given, he's just placed in the middle of an article, and I don't know why. Were they just horny for this guy? Who is this man? I'm sorry, it haunts me, and I needed to share. While Sheldon Menery never actually played Alaskan EDH with Staley, he still found the idea appealing. Menery was a competitive Magic judge of the highest level, and so he frequently traveled to Magic events, including the Pro Tour, and while doing so, he started developing his own version of EDH to play with other judges after events had finished, which he detailed in a blog post in 2004. In his EDH, which would become the definitive version, players were allowed to use any legend as their general. They were no longer limited to only those of the legends set. The restriction of not playing any other legends in a deck was also lifted, as well as the 1 per deck limitation on basic lands. He kept Test of Endurance banned, but also added the 5 Wish cards to that list. Additionally, at some undefined point that I unfortunately can't pin down precisely, Menery unbanned a singular card from the vintage ban list, being Charizard. Charizard was specifically singled out and unbanned in Commander to make clear that this was a casual format, and, I assume, to ensure that each match lasted at least half a day. His version was also unambiguous on commander damage, clearly stating that any general could kill a player by dealing a total of 21 combat damage to them. Finally, he removed the melee rule set as a base assumption, but that didn't mean that EDH was played in the free-for-all style that we're used to today. I reached out to Gavin Duggan, one of the earliest EDH advocates, to provide additional information and help fill gaps in my research. And according to him, EDH was frequently combined with all kinds of multiplayer variations of Magic. This included melee, but also 5-player star or 2-headed giant. So while melee wasn't part of the rules anymore, it was frequently played. Apart from these changes, Menery kept the rules of Alaskan EDH, including the 200 total life points and the limit of one of each general per local community. At the end of this blog post, he invited people to come play EDH with him at an event, but he included the stipulation that they first had to message him to reserve their general, and that the reservation process was done on a first-come, first-served basis, meaning only one participant could play any given general. Usually, he would have kept a few reservations for his fellow judges, but at this particular event, he was the only one of his friends present, so he opened up the doors for everybody. From what I can tell, this event went pretty well. Also included in this blog post was an example deck, his Arcades Sabbath deck. Interestingly, it included both Bringer of the White Dawn and Bringer of the Blue Dawn, both of which are creatures with the Wooburg mana symbols in their text box, meaning that at this point, color identity didn't include the text box. Menery also explained how his deck was played, highlighting specifically cheating out Darksteel Colossus with Defense of the Heart and using Caracas to bounce opposing generals. This deck also played a multitude of tutors and extra turn spells, cards that I think, in our modern understanding of the game, are a bit frowned upon in casual play. Please don't understand this as me trying to speak ill of Menery, but I don't think I would have enjoyed playing against this deck. And I believe that's because it was built with a more competitive mindset than what I would expect today, which we'll see more of in a moment. A bit later that same year, Menery wrote another blog post talking about Pro Tour Columbus and his experience judging the event as well as playing EDH there. He described a handful of games, casually mentioning that one of them had 8 players. This wasn't unusual at the time. EDH pods were a lot more flexible in player counts. There has actually never been a rule that dictated how many players should play in an EDH pod. But of course today we are used to 4-player matches. Back in the day though, they just played with however many were available. The games also seem to be much more casually hostile, if that makes any sense, missing many of our modern courtesies. For example, Menery described how a player cut his own throat by dust bowling half the mana base of a different player, and how he then floated 15 mana, played Upheaval, dropped a Sousa Lost But Seeking, and went to town. Menery didn't even win this game, and instead left to play some one-on-one EDH after getting knocked out. Also included in this post was an update to the ban list, which now included Ancestral Recall, Balance, Black Lotus, Library of Alexandria, the Moxen, Time Walk, and World Gorger Dragon. The Vicious had been unbanned, but were instead ruled to only allow to get cards that were exiled during the current game. He also had a watch list of cards that he was worried about. This included Beacon of Immortality, Biorhythm, and Crucible of Worlds. Not Upheaval though. Upheaval was fine. The watchlist would continue to be a part of the ban list until June 2009, basically offering a warning that the cards on there might get banned soon. Menery continued reserving generals for his fellow judges, but he now imposed a restriction that a reservation could only be made if a judge had played a general at least once before. The restriction of only one of each general per community was still taken very seriously, and reserved ones would only free up if a player didn't attend an event. Menery even wrote that if you think you have a legitimate claim to a general, email me. The idea here was that individual players were supposed to become associated with specific generals, treating EDH almost as if it was a role-playing game, which I think is really charming. Interestingly, he switched his own reservation from Arcades to Feldergriff. He continued hosting EDH events, mostly for other judges, but over time, the format began attracting more and more attention from people outside of his immediate community, and Menery did a great job at guiding those interested into the format. And so, over time, EDH began to grow. But with popularity comes a need for stability. In 2006, Menery founded the EDH Rules Committee, an organization made up of hand-picked judges and other community members that continued developing and refining EDH. Based upon the description given in a 2007 Star City Games article by Benny Smith, it was quickly approaching its modern iteration. Each general now started the game in exile, could be cast from there, and could optionally return to it when destroyed. Their mana cost would then increase by 2 for each time they were cast from exile before. However, the rules explicitly stated that sending a general to exile was a replacement effect, meaning that death triggers wouldn't occur. If a player wanted to use a general with a death trigger, they would have had to let them properly go to the graveyard. It's also worth noting that the return to exile clause for generals only applied to death. In any other circumstance, like being bounced back into hand or shuffled into a deck, generals were subject to the same rules as any other creature. Forcing an opponent to shuffle their general away was a brutal play, especially as more legendary creatures became available and players could build more focused decks around them. At first, this was still a bit tricky, as with the introduction of playing generals from exile, all generals had their mana costs increased to a minimum of 6. No matter which general, their first cast was always rounded up to at least 6 mana. According to Gavin, this rule was called the Hexasphere rule and was primarily there to stop cards like Rofellos or Urtai, which weren't banned yet, from dominating the more expensive legends in the early game. But the Hexasphere rule was unintuitive, and so by the time of the Star City Games article, it had already been removed. A consequence of that was that Rofellos, Llanowar Emissary, was considered so powerful that he was explicitly banned as a general. The ban list as a whole saw quite the expansion and isn't worth listing in full anymore, but I do find it funny that Upheaval finally made its way on there. Additionally, all players now always started at 40 life, and color identity was clarified, prohibiting decks from generating mana outside of their color identity. Should a deck create any off-color mana, then it was instead changed to colorless. Finally, and most interestingly, there were 3 cards that received functional erratas within the EDH rules. Caracas and Riftsweeper were both changed to not work on generals, and Runetail Kitsune Ascendant flipped at 60 life instead of 30. These erratas stuck around until about 2008, when they were deemed too confusing for newer players and removed. I've gathered this and a lot of the information coming up from a forum thread written on MTG Nexus by Cryogen, who took it upon himself to preserve all of the regular RC ban list and rule update announcements. EDH was clearly going through a streamlining process, with a larger emphasis placed on generals and an overall simplification of the rules. It was changing from a small side event to play with Menery and his friends to a proper format with potential for mainstream success. In 2009, Plane Chase was released, which introduced the Plane Chase format and playing cards. Playing cards were universal rules that applied to all players, rather than spells that could be cast. This meant they required a distinct space to exist within the gameplay system of Magic, and that space ended up being called the Command Zone. The Rules Committee immediately jumped at the chance to give generals their own space instead of just lingering in exile, and so generals now started the game in the command zone. At this moment, the open play rule for generals was also adopted. The open play rule gave everybody access to all generals. No longer were they restricted to one per player per community. Now, I don't know how much of this was planned, I assume quite a bit of it, but not too long after that, something unprecedented happened that the RC changelog described as follows. December 2nd, 2010. The world ended. Planets fell from the sky. The seas rose up in anger. On December 2nd, 2010, Wizards of the Coast announced official Magic the Gathering Commander products. This is when the generals retired and the commanders replaced them. With the release of the first EDH precons, called Commander 2011, EDH became an official Magic the Gathering format and was rebranded to Commander, although many players and the RC themselves often continue to refer to the game as EDH, and even commanders as generals. With the RC now well established and in charge of a format that wasn't just blossoming but beginning to thrive, the EDH leadership started filling in the few gaps that still remained. They introduced the game's first official mulligan rule, the partial Paris mulligan. For a partial Paris mulligan, each player first drew their initial opening hand of 7 cards. They then got to choose any number of those cards to exile, keeping the remainder in hand, before drawing a number of cards equal to how many they exiled, -1. This process could be repeated any number of times, always reducing the total number of cards drawn. Once a player decided to stop, they would then shuffle all cards that were exiled during the mulligan process into their deck. Gavin mentioned that while this was the official mulligan, in his estimation, only about half of all EDH players ever adopted it, instead sticking to their own variations. Here's also where we find the first explicit discussions of gameplay philosophy. Allow me to read out this excerpt in its entirety, as I think it'll give us an interesting insight into how Commander was different back then and how it still continued to change even while shepherded by the RC. EDH is designed first and foremost for social players. It cannot be all things to all people. Nevertheless, many people like to play EDH for prizes or other non-social incentives. Those incentives can help build communities and playgroups, but they can also undermine the social contract which keeps EDH balanced. When running a competitive EDH event, the recommended list of cards to avoid is one place to start. It is not, however, nor is it intended to be, comprehensive. It still allows for a very high level of power, in part because there are many 2-card instant wins in the history of Magic. Additional structure is required to keep degeneracy in check. To that end, a selection of optional rules are provided here for prospective TOs or players who find their playgroup can't find a balance. This statement is fascinating to me, because while it still firmly places the emphasis of the format on casual play, it also acknowledges, and I would argue, even encourages, competitive EDH events by trying to offer additional guidance for such endeavors. If, for a moment, we jump forward in time to the present day, then we can see that the RC clearly and unambiguously discouraged CEDH. But on our journey through the history of EDH, we have seen strategies, decks, and discussions about the game that make me believe that for a long time, the player mentality was actually a lot closer to CEDH than what we are used to today. I'm not saying that the decks were as optimized, but instead that there was less ambiguousness to what winning meant and how one should behave on their path to victory. Cheating out Darksteel Colossus and casting Upheaval without a win condition fits with a more cutthroat understanding of the game that was open to the idea of tournaments and other competitive events. So, let's have a look at the alternative rules that the RC proposed that might fit well for competitive players. Optional Rule A: Sideboards. Every player started with a sideboard of 10 cards, in addition to their regular commander deck. Then commanders were announced, and the players were given 3 minutes to substitute cards in their decks with cards from their sideboard. Sideboards were strongly recommended as a necessary defense against brokenness and degeneracy in an EDH environment where no gentleman's agreement on style of play exists. In other words, see EDH. Gavin had mentioned that this rule actually used to be quite popular in some local communities, and I can see why. I think it's really interesting. I would actually love to try this one, especially while playing CEDH, although a 3-minute time window seems maybe a tad short. Optional Rule B: Victory Points. Instead of only the traditional survival win condition, this rule encouraged organizers to offer additional or even fully alternative ways to score a commander game. The RC said that prizes could be awarded for things like most combat damage dealt in a single turn, biggest mana pool, commander damage kills, or most mana paid for a commander. They argued that by encouraging players to play for disparate, interesting goals, everyone has a more rewarding social experience. This I find strange. One of the quirks of Commander is that only one player out of 4 can win, effectively leading to a 25% individual win rate. With larger groups, this win rate would be even lower. In theory, additional goals could help alleviate that, as they give more players an opportunity to shine. However, the goals proposed here were all about doing something the most, which is yet again something that only 1 out of 4 players could do. And in all likelihood, the person to deal the most combat damage and have the biggest mana pool was also the most likely to win. I understand the idea here, but I feel like the proposed additional objectives wouldn't do a good job of enabling this idea. Instead, they should have been something that anybody can fulfill, like for example having 5 lands in play or 10 cards in hand. Thresholds instead of contests. But I'm getting a bit off track here. Let's move on to Optional Rule C: Democratic Victory. Instead of awarding players solely for winning games, after the match is done, they could vote for who they enjoyed playing with the most. Let's say the winner received 2 points for winning a game. Then this rule suggested that each player should also vote for who they would like to receive an additional point, meaning that while you might technically have won the match, somebody else could receive twice the points for, I guess, being a cool person to hang out with or for having an interesting deck. This is an incredibly bizarre rule, and I have no idea why anybody would think that it could possibly work without getting everybody upset at each other. Keep in mind that these optional rules are specifically suggestions for running competitive events, which feels like the worst place to have this level of open judgment baked into the system. Either way, the final optional rule was Rule D: the League Rule. The League Rule brought back the old style of 1 unique commander per player per league. Importantly, commanders that were reserved within the League Rule were also banned from the 99s of other decks. This section also linked to the roll call section of the EDH forums, which was intended to help users find players for their league, but from what I can tell, it was never popular. Even threads by Menery himself got little attention. I think it's fascinating how something so essential to the originators of the format simply wouldn't get traction from the larger community. But it doesn't really surprise me. An EDH league, as envisioned, would always see each player piloting the same deck, which I think many of us would find tedious in the long run. From here, the Rules Committee focused primarily on the ban list, adding and removing cards as they saw fit. I'll highlight a few of these that I think are interesting, but just know that this is always happening in the background. However, even during this era, a few rules were still adjusted. In December 2010, color identity was changed to now include all mana symbols in the text box of a card. This was done specifically to enable commanders that previously invalidated themselves, like for example Memnarch or Bosch Iron Golem, both of which were colorless creatures but had activated abilities that required colored mana. Keep in mind that at this point in time, it wasn't possible to generate mana outside of a deck's color identity. So not only were Memnarch or Bosch not allowed to play lands that would generate the color of mana they needed, but even if they used some trickery to get access to those colors, it would simply become colorless again. While this rule change to color identity made it more difficult to play certain cards, it also allowed commanders with activated abilities to function properly. Then, in September 2011, Charizard was finally banned. What I find fascinating here is one of the reasons given why this ban took so long, being that it provided a potent tool for aggressive decks such as White Weenie, which, in my opinion, is crazy. The reason for banning it then was that players were apparently abusing Charizard by forking it to keep the game in an endless loop, which is also very funny. The days continued until May 2013, when Wizards of the Coast redesigned the Legend rule, now only restricting any given player to one copy of a legendary. Legendary creatures no longer acted as inbuilt removal for the same legendaries of other players. This was clearly a very positive change for the format, which the RC acknowledged in their September update of that same year. As part of this update, the RC retired the League rule, with the reason given that the new Legend rule made it irrelevant, but I suspect that at least part of it also stemmed from it never gaining much traction in the larger Magic community. Alongside the farewell to Commander Leagues, the RC rephrased the optional rules section as house rules instead. This was because apparently people were getting confused in ways that confused me. For example, one reported question was if the optional rules applied on a per player or per playgroup basis, which I feel is a curious question. Either way, the rules given didn't change, just the way they were presented was less committed. Almost exactly a year later, the Banned as Commander section of the ban list was removed, and every card on it was either unbanned or placed on the regular ban list. Now, I have a bit of a confession to make. I'm still fairly new to Magic the Gathering. I've only been playing for around a year and a half, so all of this long predates my experience with the game. But I listen, and I read, and I learn. I try to absorb as much information about Magic as I can. In that endeavor, I've constantly seen people talk everywhere about the Banned as Commander list, and how it should be brought back as it could help solve modern issues. At this point, I would like for all of you listening right now to take a guess as to how many cards were on the Banned as Commander list when it was removed. How many commanders were banned? I'm gonna give you a moment. It was 4. Braid's Cabal Minion, Rofellos Llanowar Emissary, Arayo Soratami Ascendant, and Kokusho, the Evening Star. The Banned as Commander list was removed because it just didn't have any cards on it, which lined up with an interview I found from 2018 in which the Rules Committee was asked about returning the Banned as Commander list, to which they replied that at points all it did was keep 2 cards playable in the format, and that wasn't worth the complexity budget of having an additional rule. I find it hard to disagree with this. As you guys know, I place high emphasis on the complexity budget. It was also a huge surprise to me that this sub-ban list that keeps being talked about was so tiny. There were only 4 creatures on it. Out of those 4, 3 ended up on the regular ban list, but Kokusho was simply unbanned. Kokusho is another strange case to me. Keep in mind that at the time, for a commander's death trigger to activate, it had to actually go to the graveyard. Returning a commander to the command zone was a replacement effect that stopped death triggers from happening. Despite that, Kokushu was widely considered so powerful that I found many forum threads of people arguing that she could never be unbanned. Clearly, that wasn't the case. Kokushu was unbanned and has been unproblematic ever since, which brings me to an interesting theory. Earlier, we discussed that EDH used to be frequently played in groups larger than 4 players, and given that environment, I can see why Kokushu could be considered an issue. Even when played in a reanimator shell, I can't see Kokushu being overly powerful in a 4-player group. But at an 8-player table? Oh dear, that sounds like a nightmare. Now I have to be honest, I didn't find any evidence for this. This is just a theory. And according to Gavin, Kokushu was problematic even in 4-player pods of that era. Maybe the power level was just low enough that the game couldn't handle a 5-mana dragon that had to die before she did anything. Either way, she's unbanned now and I kinda wanna build a Kokushu deck. Jumping forward to March 2015, the Commander Tuck rule was changed. Before, commanders could only be returned to the command zone if they had either been destroyed or exiled. This allowed players to use cards like Banned Charm to put opposing commanders into their owners' libraries, which then encouraged players to run more tutors to recover their commander. And tutors, of course, go against the spirit of the singleton rule. Starting with this patch then, commanders could always return to the command zone, no matter which other zone they were forced into. A year later, in January 2016, the partial Paris mulligan was replaced with the Vancouver mulligan. The Vancouver mulligan being that a player draws 1 less card per mulligan but gets to scry once at the start of the game if they mulliganed. This is also the first time a free mulligan for multiplayer games was mentioned, although from what I can tell, it was already considered standard. Also in January 2016, Oath of the Gatewatch released and introduced colorless mana costs, which was now different from generic mana costs. This created an issue within Commander, because remember, any off-color mana was turned into colorless. The question then became if that colorless mana could be used to pay for colorless mana costs, and that created understandable rule confusion. In response, the RC changed the rules to allow off-color mana to be created. In September of that year then, the RC removed the house rules section of the website. Their reasoning was again that there was confusion over which rules were official and which weren't. The website now only had official rules, but it continued to encourage players to play with their own house rules, as Commander was more of a framework than a hard system. On November 30th, 2017, something that I think was really fun happened, and that Gavin also described as one of the high points of the RC's interaction with the community. Anticipating the release of Unstable, many cards were unbanned in Commander until the next ban announcement on January 15th. However, this was done with a list of exceptions, as some cards remained banned. I think this is really cool, a sort of community-wide deck building challenge. What a fantastic idea. I wish I had already been playing back then. This seems like a ton of fun. It's also something that could easily be done again in the future, with either cards or just by actually doing a community deck building challenge centered around some other theme. Maybe an idea for WotC there. January 2019 then saw the establishment of the Commander Advisory Group, adding additional guiding voices to the committee, and in April, Rule 0 was added to the official rules page. Rule 0 read, "These are the official rules of Commander. Local groups are welcome to modify them as they see fit. If you'd like an exception to these rules, especially in an unfamiliar environment, please get the approval of the other players before the game begins." However, this didn't last long. Only a year later, the RC launched a new website, and Rule 0 wasn't found anywhere on it. Instead, the wording in the philosophy document included an encouragement to use the rules and ban list as a baseline to optimize your own experience. There was also no longer an official mulligan rule. Soon after, commanders had their rules changed to now allow for death triggers, even if they returned to the command zone. The RC posted a very detailed discussion of all the different ways they had considered implementing this, including adding counters to commanders or giving players a special action they could use at any time when their commander wasn't on the board to return it to the command zone. In the end, they settled on the most intuitive solution, but I just think it's fun to see everything they had considered. Game design is rarely a straight road, and it's important to take silly detours, because sometimes the detours are super cool. Since death triggers now worked for commanders, they deliberately pointed out Kokushu as a potential problem again. I need to know so badly what Kokushu did to the RC that she deserved this much attention. Something about her traumatized those people, and I think that's just hilarious. Look at my beautiful queen. Isn't she just wonderful? I really need to build a Kokushu deck. Finally, the wish rules were also adjusted so that the only abilities that bring other cards into the game from outside the game wouldn't function. This was done specifically to allow for companions. And that's it. This was the last rules update to Commander. However, there's one more thing that I think is of note. In 2024, the RC updated their philosophy and rules document again, streamlining a lot of the language. There was no longer any mention of house rules or alternative ways to play. Commander was now set in stone, with the rules clearly defined and solidified. Now that we are approximately 3 hours into this video, maybe I should introduce myself. Hi, I'm Baumi. I'm a Commander player, I'm a content creator, and I'm a game developer. I want to, and I have been, making videos about Commander. But as I was writing those, I found myself with a lot of assumptions, which quickly turned into questions. Questions that stemmed from me not knowing the history of this game, because I was busy playing Dota for the last 15 years. But unfortunately, Commander is a physical game. I can't just open the Git repository and browse the change history. I needed to do the research myself. And so I did. But as I was doing my research, I was yet again struck by the incredible decay of information on the internet. Commander is an old game, and old games come with a lot of history. History that's yet again already being forgotten. This isn't the first time I'm dealing with this. When I was working on Stories of Dota, I had to work through a lot of my own misconceptions and confused memories. But at least there, I could just go and watch the old games to study them from scratch. But there are no recordings of old EDH games. All I've got to work with are articles from the old RC website, Star City Games, and others that are randomly scattered across the internet. Many of these are only available via the Internet Archive, and the Internet Archive unfortunately doesn't host everything. That's why I reached out to Gavin. I needed a primary source to confirm a couple of things that I otherwise wouldn't have been able to. And even now, I'm not confident I was able to find every detail. But I do believe that I managed to put together a fairly complete timeline, and I will happily add additional information from you guys into the pinned comment of this video. I firmly believe that history is worth knowing for knowledge itself, and is worth preserving for the act alone. Without people like Cryogen or Charlie Hall, we would have lost so much already. And I'm hoping I was able to contribute to that effort with this video. But there's one additional point I would like to make. Highlander became Elder Dragon Highlander, which became Commander. And on that journey, the game changed a lot. And I would argue for the better. That's generally the goal, isn't it? Game development aims to improve the product. I already made videos on this channel that critique Magic and Commander from a game development point of view, while offering suggestions on improvement. And I will continue to do so, because I think that rule updates are usually good. But I've also been on the internet for long enough to know that people have an aversion to any kind of changes, even when they would be beneficial. I think the way people discussed Kokushu was a prime example of this, where everybody agreed that she couldn't ever be unbanned, and then when she was unbanned, things were fine. Of course, that might have been because the game had changed, but that's the point. Change begets change, and everything is always changing. There are always new Magic sets that are getting released. We should be open-minded to adjusting old rules to a modern game. In other words, rework Commander damage! Yes, this was secretly a Commander damage video! Okay, I'm just joking, but you know, maybe. Either way, I hope you guys enjoyed this video. I hope you learned something from it. I certainly learned a lot while researching everything, and I'm very, very glad that I did it, because now I feel like I can actually talk about Commander with a certain level of expertise that I didn't have before. Either way, if you did enjoy the video, don't forget to give it a thumbs up. That's really helpful. That would be really fantastic. Genuinely, if you're seeing this right now, that means you watched enough of the video to get to this point. I earned it, frankly speaking. Give it a thumbs up. Subscribe if you want to. Check out what else is going on the channel. And I'll see you guys next week.